In the summer of 1945, the Japanese home islands were dying, not from the atomic bombs that would soon fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though those horrors were coming, not from the firebombing campaign that had already reduced Tokyo and dozens of other cities to ash. Japan was dying more quietly, more slowly, from a strangulation that had been tightening for 3 years. The rice ration had fallen to levels that could not sustain human health. Factories stood idle for lack of raw materials. Ships rusted in harbors because there was no fuel to move them. The mighty empire that had once stretched from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands was being choked to death, and the executioners were American submarines. This is the story of the most successful naval campaign in history, measured by the ratio of resources invested to damage inflicted. It is the story of how 2% of American naval personnel sank 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping lost during the war. It is the story of how a force that never exceeded 50,000 men brought a nation of 70 million to its knees. And it is a story that has been largely forgotten, overshadowed by the carrier battles and amphibious assaults that captured the public imagination. The submarine war against Japan was silent, invisible, and decisive. Its consequences shaped the Pacific War more profoundly than any other single factor. Japan's vulnerability to submarine blockade was built into its geography and economy. The home islands possessed almost no natural resources essential to modern warfare. Oil came from the Dutch East Indies, 3,000 miles to the south. Iron ore came from Manchuria and Malaya. Rubber came from Southeast Asia. Rice came from Korea and Taiwan. Everything that Japan needed to fight, and much of what it needed simply to survive, had to cross water. The merchant fleet that carried these vital cargoes was the circulatory system of the empire, and severing that system would be fatal. American strategists understood this vulnerability from the beginning. War Plan Orange, developed during the interwar years, had always assumed that a Pacific conflict would include submarine operations against Japanese commerce. The problem was that American submarines in December 1941 were not ready to execute this mission. The boats were adequate, the crews were trained, but the weapons were catastrophically flawed. The Mark 14 torpedo, the standard weapon of the American submarine force, was one of the most defective pieces of ordnance ever issued to a military service. Its failures would cost lives, extend the war, and create a scandal that the Navy would spend decades trying to forget. The Mark 14 had 3 separate defects, each capable of causing a miss or a dud on its own. The magnetic exploder, designed to detonate the torpedo beneath a ship's hull, where the damage would be greatest, was unreliable and often triggered prematurely, or not at all. The contact exploder, the backup system that should have functioned when the magnetic exploder failed, was too fragile to survive the impact of a direct hit. And the depth-keeping mechanism ran 4 feet deeper than set, causing torpedoes aimed at a ship's waterline to pass harmlessly underneath. Together, these flaws meant that American submarines spent the first 21 months of the war firing weapons that frequently did not work. The human cost of these failures was borne by the submarine crews who risked their lives to reach firing positions only to watch their torpedoes fail to explode or miss entirely. Commander Dudley Morton of the USS Wahoo reported firing 15 torpedoes at a convoy in January 1943, achieving only 3 hits despite near-perfect shooting solutions. Commander Howard Gilmore of the USS Growler was killed on the bridge of his submarine after a surface engagement that might have been avoided if his torpedoes had worked properly in an earlier attack. Across the Pacific, American submarines returned from patrol with stories of attacks that should have succeeded but didn't, of tankers and transports that escaped because the weapons designed to kill them were fundamentally broken. The Bureau of Ordnance, responsible for torpedo development and production, refused to acknowledge the problems for months. Complaints from submarine commanders were dismissed as alibis for poor marksmanship. Test firings conducted under controlled conditions failed to replicate the failures reported in combat, partly because the tests were designed to confirm the Bureau's assumptions rather than challenge them. The institutional culture of the peacetime Navy, with its emphasis on hierarchy and deference to technical authority, protected the bureaucracy from accountability. Meanwhile, submariners died and Japanese ships survived. The crisis was eventually resolved through the persistence of individual commanders and the intervention of senior leadership willing to challenge the establishment. Admiral Charles Lockwood, who took command of Pacific submarine operations in early 1943, made torpedo reliability his personal crusade. He ordered tests using live warheads against underwater cliffs, proving definitively that the torpedoes ran too deep. He conducted drop tests that demonstrated the fragility of the contact exploder. He provided irrefutable evidence that the magnetic exploder was unreliable. By September 1943, the last of the major defects had been identified and corrected. The American submarine force finally had weapons that worked. The transformation that followed was dramatic and immediate. Sinkings increased sharply in the final months of 1943 and continued to rise throughout 1944. American submarines, no longer handicapped by defective ordnance, began to achieve their potential as commerce destroyers. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1942, American submarines sank approximately 180 Japanese merchant ships, totaling just over 700,000 tons. In 1943, despite the ongoing torpedo crisis, they sank approximately 300 ships, totaling 1.5 million tons. In 1944, with reliable torpedoes and improved tactics, they sank approximately 550 ships, totaling 2.5 million tons. Japan was hemorrhaging shipping faster than it could possibly replace. The strategic impact of these losses extended far beyond the immediate destruction. Every ship sunk meant cargo that never reached its destination, oil that never fueled aircraft, steel that never became weapons, rice that never fed soldiers or civilians. The Japanese war economy, already stretched thin by the demands of a conflict spanning thousands of miles, began to crack under the pressure. Factories reduced production. Training programs were curtailed to conserve fuel. Military operations were constrained by logistics failures that could not be corrected because the ships needed to correct them were lying on the ocean floor. The oil situation was particularly critical. Japan had gone to war in 1941, partly to secure access to the petroleum resources of the Dutch East Indies, which produced enough crude to sustain the empire's military machine. But oil in Borneo was useless if it couldn't reach refineries in Japan. American submarines operating in the shipping lanes between Southeast Asia and the home islands turned those lanes into killing grounds. Tanker after tanker went down, their precious cargoes spilling into the sea rather than reaching the factories and airfields where they were desperately needed. By mid-1944, the Japanese Navy was rationing fuel so severely that training for pilots and sailors was cut to dangerous levels. Carriers that should have been practicing flight operations sat in port to conserve bunker oil. Surface ships that might have challenged American advances remained at anchor because they lacked the fuel for offensive operations. The great battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever built, spent most of the war avoiding action because Japan could not afford to fuel their boilers. When Yamato finally sorted for Okinawa in April 1945, she carried only enough oil for a one-way trip. The submarine blockade had made fuel more precious than the ships that burned it. The tactics that American submarines developed to prosecute their campaign evolved significantly as the war progressed. Early in the conflict, submarines operated individually, patrolling assigned areas and attacking targets of opportunity. This approach was consistent with American doctrine and American technology, which emphasized independence and individual initiative. But as the Japanese adapted their convoy and escort systems, and as more American submarines became available, new tactics became possible and necessary. Wolfpack operations, borrowed from German practice in the Atlantic, began to appear in the Pacific in late 1943. Groups of 3 to 5 submarines would coordinate their attacks on convoys, overwhelming the escorts through numbers and creating confusion that individual boats could exploit. The Wolfpacks were never as central to American strategy as they were to German operations. The Pacific theater was simply too vast for tight coordination. But they proved effective in certain situations, particularly against heavily defended convoys carrying critical cargoes. The use of ultra-intelligence transformed submarine operations from opportunistic hunting to precision targeting. American codebreakers had cracked Japanese naval codes early in the war, and by 1943, the intelligence derived from this source was being routinely shared with submarine commanders. Boats were vectored to intercept specific convoys based on decoded messages, arriving at precisely the right time and place to catch their targets. The Japanese never fully understood why their shipping losses were so catastrophic, why American submarines always seemed to know where to find them. The answer was ultra, a secret so closely guarded that many submarine commanders didn't know the source of the intelligence they were receiving. The human experience of submarine warfare in the Pacific was defined by extremes of boredom and terror, of isolation and intimacy. Patrols lasted weeks, sometimes months, with days of monotonous routine punctuated by moments of intense combat. The crews lived in conditions that would have been intolerable in any other service: cramped, humid, stinking of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies, breathing air that was recycled until it could barely sustain consciousness. They endured depth charge attacks that shattered light bulbs and loosened rivets, lying silent in the darkness while Japanese escorts hunted overhead. They surfaced into tropical nights to recharge batteries and refresh the atmosphere, knowing that a Japanese aircraft or warship could appear at any moment. The casualty rate among American submariners was the highest of any branch of the service. 52 submarines were lost during the war, taking nearly 3,500 men with them. The percentage of personnel killed, approximately 22% of those who served, exceeded the losses of the Marine Corps and was comparable to the worst attrition suffered by bomber crews. When a submarine was lost, it was usually lost with all hands. There was no abandoning ship in the traditional sense, no life rafts or rescue operations. A submarine that went down typically took everyone aboard to the bottom. The men who volunteered for this service came from every background and every region of America. They were motivated by patriotism, by adventure, by the extra pay that submarine duty provided, by the desire to serve in an elite force that demanded exceptional qualifications. They were tested psychologically as well as physically, screened for the claustrophobia and emotional instability that could prove fatal in the confines of a submarine. Those who passed the tests joined a community that was closer and more interdependent than any other in the military. In a submarine, everyone's survival depended on everyone else's competence. There was no room for passengers. The commanders who led these men into combat became legends within the submarine service, though most remained unknown to the general public. Dudley Morton of the Wahoo, who pioneered aggressive surface attacks and died when his boat was lost in October 1943. Richard O'Kane of the Tang, who sank more tonnage than any other American submarine commander and survived when his own torpedo circled back and destroyed his boat. Eugene Fluckey of the Barb, who attacked Japanese shipping in harbors and sent landing parties ashore to blow up a train, the only ground combat operation conducted by American submarines in the Pacific. Samuel Dealey of the Harder, who specialized in hunting Japanese destroyers and was credited with sinking 5 of them before his luck ran out. These men and their crews operated at the ragged edge of what was technically possible, pushing their boats and themselves to limits that peacetime training had never contemplated. They attacked convoys defended by multiple escorts, betting their lives on the ability to dive deep and evade counterattacks. They conducted night surface attacks at ranges so close they could see the faces of Japanese lookouts on the ships they were torpedoing. They rescued downed aviators from waters patrolled by enemy aircraft and surface vessels. They laid mines in harbors and channels that claimed victims for months after the submarines had moved on. The Japanese response to the submarine campaign was consistently inadequate, a failure of strategy and resources that magnified American successes. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized offensive operations, the decisive fleet battle that would destroy enemy forces in a single engagement. Convoy escort and anti-submarine warfare were defensive missions, inglorious and unglamorous, starved of resources and talented personnel. The destroyers and patrol craft assigned to protect merchant shipping were too few, too poorly equipped, and too indifferently trained to provide effective defense. Japanese technology also lagged behind. Radar, which American submarines used to detect targets and avoid attackers, was primitive and unreliable in Japanese service. Sonar was available but often poorly maintained. Depth charges were effective weapons when they found their targets, but Japanese tactics rarely brought them close enough to do damage. The assumptions that guided Japanese anti-submarine doctrine, that submarines were slow, limited, and easily evaded, were based on the performance of earlier submarine designs and failed to account for American improvements in speed, range, and diving capability. The statistical asymmetry of the campaign was stunning. American submarines sank over 1,200 Japanese merchant ships, totaling more than 5 million tons. They also sank approximately 200 warships, including several major fleet units. In exchange, the submarine force lost 52 boats, a ratio of destroyed to loss that exceeded 20-1. No other naval campaign in history achieved such disproportionate results. The American submarine force, never numbering more than a few hundred officers and a few thousand men, inflicted damage on Japan that entire fleets could not have matched. By the beginning of 1945, the blockade had essentially succeeded. Japanese merchant shipping, which had totaled approximately 6 million tons at the war's start, had been reduced to less than 1 million tons of operational vessels. What remained was being destroyed faster than it could be replaced, hunted in waters that offered no safety, running a gauntlet that grew deadlier with each passing month. The home islands, cut off from the resources that sustained them, were beginning to experience genuine famine. Rice rations, the basic measure of food security in Japan, had fallen to levels that caused malnutrition in adults and stunted development in children. The civilian population suffered in ways that the military high command either could not or would not acknowledge. The war's demands had already stripped Japanese agriculture of labor and equipment, reducing domestic food production. The submarine blockade eliminated the imports that might have made up the deficit. By the summer of 1945, urban populations were scavenging for food, eating weeds and roots that peacetime Japanese would have considered inedible. The mortality statistics, carefully hidden by the wartime government, showed increasing deaths from diseases related to malnutrition. The atomic bombs would kill hundreds of thousands in August, but the blockade was killing thousands every week long before the bombs fell. The industrial situation was equally catastrophic. Japan's war production peaked in late 1944 and then collapsed as raw materials became unavailable. Aircraft factories lacked aluminum. Steel mills lacked iron ore and coal. Munitions plants lacked the explosives and propellants that had come from overseas sources. The workers themselves, weakened by inadequate diets and demoralized by constant bombing, produced less even when materials were available. By July 1945, Japanese industrial output had fallen to a fraction of its wartime peak, with no prospect of recovery as long as the blockade continued. The strategic bombing campaign that has received so much historical attention was, in an important sense, secondary to the submarine blockade. General Curtis LeMay's incendiary raids destroyed factories, but many of those factories were already idle for lack of inputs. The B-29s killed workers, but the surviving workers had little to work with. The terror bombing of Japanese cities, whatever its moral implications, was attacking an economy that was already strangling. The submarines had done the essential work of cutting Japan off from the resources it needed to resist. The bombers were simply accelerating a collapse that the blockade had made inevitable. This is not to diminish the contribution of other forces to Japan's defeat. The carrier battles that destroyed Japanese naval aviation, the island-hopping campaign that seized bases ever closer to the home islands, the sacrifices of soldiers and marines who fought and died in places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. All of these were essential to victory. But the foundation on which that victory rested was the submarine blockade, the slow strangulation that weakened Japan at every level, that made every subsequent operation easier, that ensured that the enemy would be weaker tomorrow than it was today. The recognition that American submariners deserved for their contribution was slow in coming and remains incomplete. The submarine service received fewer medals, less publicity, and less historical attention than any other branch of the Navy. Partly this was a matter of secrecy. The use of ultra-intelligence required that submarine operations remain shrouded in mystery even after the war ended. Partly it was a matter of visibility. Submarines fought beneath the surface, invisible to cameras and correspondents, their victories known only through terse patrol reports that recorded tonnage sunk without drama or elaboration. Partly it was a matter of institutional politics. The surface navy and the aviation community dominated post-war planning and had little interest in sharing credit with the submarine force. The submarines themselves were mostly scrapped after the war, their technology obsolete, their hulls worn out by the demands of continuous operations. A few survive as museum ships, preserved in dry dock or floating at memorial piers, their torpedo rooms empty, their engines silent. Visitors can walk through the cramped compartments and try to imagine what it was like to spend weeks at a time in these steel tubes, hunting and being hunted, never knowing if the next dive would be the last. Most cannot imagine it. The experience was too alien, too extreme, too far removed from anything that peacetime existence can approximate. The men who served have mostly passed now, their generation fading into history. The youngest veterans of the submarine war are in their late 90s. Most died years or decades ago, their stories recorded in oral histories or lost entirely. They were modest about their accomplishments, reluctant to claim credit for victories that had required teamwork and sacrifice from everyone aboard. They knew what they had achieved, even if the broader public did not. They had fought a war in silence and darkness, had strangled an empire without fanfare or recognition, had contributed more to victory than any force of comparable size. They were the forgotten warriors of a forgotten campaign, and their campaign had been decisive. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, ending a war that had killed millions and reshaped the world. The atomic bombs played a role in that surrender, as did the Soviet declaration of war, but the condition that made surrender thinkable, the utter impossibility of continued resistance, had been created by the submarine blockade. Japan was not merely defeated in August 1945, it was incapable of fighting on even if the government had wished to do so. The cupboard was bare, the arsenal empty, the people starving. The submarines had seen to that. 5 million tons of shipping lay at the bottom of the Pacific, sent there by American torpedoes. The empire of the rising sun, which had once stretched across a quarter of the globe, had been contracted to a few starving islands, cut off from the resources that had made its ambitions possible. The instrument of this contraction was a force that never numbered more than 50,000 men, operating boats that were cramped, dangerous, and largely invisible to the public they served. They had won the war that mattered, the war of economics and logistics, the war that determined whether Japan could fight at all. And they had won it so completely that the victory was almost invisible, hidden beneath the more dramatic narratives of carrier battles and amphibious assaults. This was the Forgotten Blockade, the campaign that strangled Japan. It deserves to be remembered.